most of us can agree that heartbreak is a really painful experience. I don't know anyone who would disagree with that. I think we could safely say that, for better or for worse, heartbreak is a painful experience. And I guess you could reframe it. You could look at it as heartbreak allows you to see the depth of caring and loving that you had for someone. Because you don't just get heartbreak from love, I also think you get heartbreak from caring. And speaking of which, I also think that heartbreak tends to be associated a lot to romantic relationships. But you could get heartbroken from losing a friend. You could get heartbroken from losing a job. You could get heartbroken from failing in business. You could get heartbroken from so many other things that are not necessarily romantic relationships. And of course, you could get heartbroken from romantic relationships. And I wanted to define that because I feel like heartbreak tends to be associated only to romantic things. But truthfully, it could be associated to any type of loss. Because heartbreak normally implies that there is a form of loss and implies that you are grieving something. Maybe you had a fallout with your friend and it didn't work out, lost that friend. That's a loss. And you will grieve that loss. And we could apply this to anything: business, career, health, can also apply to health, family, and of course, most importantly and most commonly, relationships. Now, romantic breakups are super interesting because I think you discover more about yourself and more about what heartbreak truly means through the lens of a romantic framework. And I actually have noticed that there's a few patterns. There's five main patterns, really, when it comes to heartbreak. There's five patterns that happen during and after every single heartbreak. And I would like to share that with you because I find that it will be useful in some way for you to know. And this is something that I've noticed from my experiences, but also just generally something I've noticed from someone else's experiences and just observing other people's experiences and, of course, reflecting on my own. And there's just these clear patterns that happen during and after every single heartbreak. Number one is the story that you tell yourself. Now, what tends to happen is you either tell yourself a negative and false story, or you tell yourself a positive and truthful story. And what tends to happen, interestingly enough, is we tend to default to the negative and the false. And what I mean by that is when a heartbreak happens, there is instantly some sort of narrative in your mind as to what has happened and why. Like you have an instant narrative and a self-talk and a self-story about that event, about that incident, about that situation. And I'll give you a personal example. Years and years ago, when I got my first heartbreak, and I'm acting like this is a gift, but in hindsight, it's a lesson learned. But when I first got heartbroken years and years ago, my immediate self-story was that I wasn't good enough. It was that I wasn't worthy. It was that I wasn't worth it. Which is obviously not true. But that was the story that I was telling myself, despite it not being true, right? I did believe that for a moment and for a season, but that turned out not to be true, of course. So my point is, we instantly default to some sort of story that we have to tell ourselves because our brain has to make sense of the world, and we use shortcuts in our brain to get to certain conclusions. And so, to me, after that first heartbreak, I was telling myself that I wasn't enough, that I wasn't worthy, that I wasn't worth it. And that is a negative story, but it's also a false one. And so you need to reframe that. If that is the case, you need to reframe it to be a positive story and a truthful one. And I feel like a lot of people will hear the word positive and it has this connotation as if it's like you don't need to lie. Like positivity is not being fake or lying or pretending that the bad doesn't exist. Okay, that's not what it is. Like you could tell a story that is positive and truthful, without having to fake it or pretend it. And an example would be back then, instead of saying that I wasn't good enough, I could have just said that this isn't the right person for me. And there will be someone who is. Notice how I'm not being fairy tale-y about it. It's not a fairy tale. I'm not pretending that things didn't happen that weren't great, which is obviously heartbreak. Heartbreak isn't a great thing, is it? But notice how I am being truthful whilst telling a positive story. Because it's not a negative one. It's not destructing or destroying or self-destructing in my own narrative. It's just a positive and truthful story. And so that's a big one. It's focus on that story that you're telling yourself. What story are you telling yourself? Because most of the times you'll default to a negative and a false one. And I want you to focus on a positive and a truthful one. Number 2 is your coping mechanism. Now, this is really, really interesting because we all have coping mechanisms. Some are healthier than others, some are unhealthier than others, but we all default to coping. Because when something major happens in our lives, the only thing that we have at our disposal that we feel like we know how to use is coping. We tend to cope. We cope a lot, actually. Let me give you a couple of examples. After my first heartbreak years and years ago, my coping mechanism was I was just going clubbing left, right, center. Like I was going out, I was partying, I was coping through clubbing and partying. That was my coping mechanism back then. After my second heartbreak, which again was years and years ago, I actually went all in on the gym. Like I was crazy about the gym. I was also crazy about work, so I was doing more overtime at work. And of course, I also, and I say of course because a lot of people will relate to this, I also binge watched quite a lot of Netflix. I actually watched Power. I ran through every single episode and season of Power back then. And I'm telling you this because we all have coping mechanisms. We all cope in some form, shape, or way. It's how we cope that differs. And you could look at it from the lens of there's healthy coping mechanisms and there is unhealthy coping mechanisms. And it seems quite obvious, but I'm going to say it anyways. You should probably default to the healthy coping mechanisms because unhealthy coping mechanisms such as drugs and alcohol, like those things are not going to help you at all. Right? We need to cope because we need to distract our minds. Because if we don't distract our minds and we don't find a way to unwind and relax, our minds will be consistently thinking about that one thing that happened. And it dawns on us. It really, really does. It just dawns on us. And so when you think about coping, you got to remember that it's okay to have a coping mechanism. It's okay to be coping. What is not okay is to use that cope as avoidance. Coping shouldn't mean avoiding. And I think a lot of people get lost in that. A lot of people cope, but for them it's just a way to avoid something. And in this case, it's facing what's happening. And I'm not a fan of that because there is no way, you have no chance, you have zero chance to heal from it if you don't deal with it. That's the reality. You have zero chance to heal from it if you don't deal with it. So the only way that you can heal from this heartbreak is to deal with the heartbreak. And you cannot do that by avoiding it. So you can use cope to relax, unwind, and even distract yourself a little bit. But you cannot use it to avoid your heartbreak and avoid facing your emotions and avoid facing the situation. You cannot do that because guess what? It's not going to play out in your benefit. It's not going to work out. I'm telling you. Use it to relax, unwind, and maybe just distract yourself a little bit, but don't use it to avoid it because the only way to heal from it is to deal with it. Then we have the journey that you choose. Now, this might sound very obvious, but there's only two choices here. You either choose the journey of staying healed or choose the journey of staying hurt. You either choose to be healing or you choose to be hurting. And I know that it's really obvious in your mind and you're going to say, well, Eric, of course I'm going to choose to heal and not to hurt. Of course. Is it that obvious? Because if you are not actively healing, you are passively hurting. If you are not consciously healing, you are subconsciously hurting. If you are not intentionally healing, you are unintentionally hurting. So let me ask you again, is it that obvious? Because most of us think that we are healing, but we're actually just hurting. I'm going to say something that is probably, again, a controversial take. I tend to give a lot of out-of-the-box takes in this podcast, but I'm going to share this with you because I think it's important for you to know, which is, have you ever heard the saying, time heals? Have you ever heard that saying? Because I've heard it, and it's absolute bullshit. Time does not heal. And a lot of people will disagree with me on this one, but this is the truth. Time doesn't heal. Time helps, but it doesn't heal. And what I mean by this, and I'm going to give an example, is, would you agree that 5 years is a long time? Would you agree that 5 years is a long time? Because I would argue that we could agree that 5 years is a pretty long time. Now, if that is true, if 5 years is a long time and time really heals, then why is it that I know people, and I know someone that I'm thinking specifically of, who has had a heartbreak 5 years ago and still hasn't healed from it? Why is that? So if we agree that 5 years is a long time, and we agree that time heals, which I don't agree, but let's just run the example, then why is it that I have someone in my life, a friend that I know, who has been heartbroken for 5 years and still hasn't healed from it? The truth and the answer to that question is because, one, time doesn't heal, and two, the only way to heal is to actually make conscious, active, and intentional efforts towards healing. If you're not actively trying to heal, then you won't heal just with time. Time doesn't heal. Again, this is one of those things that sounds right, so therefore it must be right. Time heals. Sounds right, it's motivational to say, it's not right. Because time alone by itself cannot heal you. This person that I'm thinking of, they thought that if they just carry on focused on their work and carried on focused on the gym and just carried on with life normally, they thought that if they just did that, that naturally they would heal because time heals, but it doesn't. You have to make efforts towards healing. That's the only way to heal is by making efforts, and only you can heal yourself. Time cannot heal you for you. Time helps, but it doesn't heal. And then I want to talk about missing the routine, which is also another pattern that happens after heartbreak. People tend to miss the routine, and I'll tell you something. And before I do that, there's something that I just want to talk about and mention quickly, which is what we just said about time not healing and you having to make conscious efforts towards healing. The biggest proof of that is if you have a plant at home and you don't water it for 2 months, most likely it will die. But if you keep watering it for 2 months, most likely it will grow. So what that says to me, and what that should say to you, is that we're either growing or dying in any aspect of life. Like if you go to the gym consistently, you're going to be building muscle. If you don't go to the gym consistently, you're going to be losing muscle. The pendulum is always swinging. Whether you like it or not, it's always swinging. And things in life are either growing or they're dying. Always. It's never just one or the other, and it's never stopping. It's always in motion. Going back to missing the routine. This is a pattern that's very common, which is, I'd argue, you probably don't miss the person as much as you miss what you had with them. And that might sound like it's the same thing, but it isn't. Right? You miss the morning texts. You miss the goodnight texts. You miss having someone that you could call on the phone. You miss going on dates, the cinema trips. You miss the cuddles. You miss waking up next to someone. You miss falling asleep next to someone. You miss what you had. You miss what you had built more often than you miss the person. Sometimes, yes, indeed, you do miss the person. But I think more often than not, you actually, if we're just being honest, you're actually just missing the routine. And the only way to overcome that is if you build a routine that is centered around you. So, this is one of the reasons why people who smoke tend to struggle to quit smoking. It's because they just think that if I just stop, it will work. And most of the times it doesn't. You cannot just stop like that, for most people anyways. You have to replace it with something. That's why, it's like chewing gums are really famous, or sort of like sweets and candies are really famous to replace that temptation to smoke, right? It's because you have to replace it with something else in order to make yourself move past it. So in terms of missing the routine with the person that you had, you have to create a routine that is now focused on you, because you have time, space, and energy that you were using and dedicating to someone else, then now you can allocate on yourself. So create a routine for yourself filled with the things that you love and enjoy the most. And that will help you circumvent that necessity or that missing feeling of a routine. And last but not least, the pattern that I want to talk about is, and this is very, very common, craving the closure. A lot of us look at closure as this respectful conversation that happens at the end of a relationship, and everyone just goes their ways, and it's respectful, and it's just an end of a chapter. It's a nice way to turn the book or turn the page. Like, most of the times, closure doesn't really look like that. Don't get me wrong, if you are lucky enough to get that, then power to you, that's amazing, respect, that is incredible. But most of the times, that's not how closure is. And I think a lot of people struggle with that. A lot of people feel like they are owed closure, like they are owed this sense of closure. And you might be right. Maybe you are owed that. But closure isn't always a conversation or a respectful conversation. Closure isn't always having the conversation. Sometimes closure is not having the conversation. Sometimes that is closure. And that's okay. And you need to be okay with that. You need to be at peace with the fact that that is that. Because the way that they loved you is very, very representative of the way that they left you. And everything you need to know about the way that they loved you is in the way that they left you. And that should be enough closure. It's peace with the fact that this is what it is, and I need to move on, and I need to learn and accept that this is what's happening in my life, and it's a learning growth curve for me. Sometimes closure isn't having the conversation. Sometimes it isn't. Now, we're approaching the new segment of the podcast called Just a Moment, where I look at the conversation cards that Stephen Bartlett made, and I take out one card, and I read out the question and answer the question. And so depending on what question it is, we might get a bit deep here on the podcast, maybe not. We'll see. But I thought it would be a fun way to end the podcast. So let's do this. You can see it first. What do I have here? So I have a question from David Harwood, and the person who answered the question was Mary Folio, if I'm pronouncing the name correctly. So the question is, what lesson have you learned from your lowest point, and is there anything about it that you're grateful for? This is very interesting because I guess I could just keep the answer related to what we've been talking about on this episode. One of the biggest lessons that I've learned from heartbreak, and I'd consider heartbreak a low point in time in my life. One of the biggest lessons that I've learned is definitely loving myself. And I know it sounds cliche. I know, I get it. But I don't think I fully understood what loving myself meant until I actually was forced to love myself. And sometimes we overlove others to compensate for the lack of love that we have for ourselves. And once you realize that, you'll realize that actually you are your number one priority, and that the way that you love yourself sets the tone and the standard for how you should love everyone else. And actually, the love that you show for yourself sets the standard that you accept in relationships in general. And I think that's a beautiful thing. So I'd say that's one lesson that I learned from a low point in my life. It was heartbreak, the low point, and it was loving myself, the lesson. And I'm entirely grateful for it. Thank you so much for listening. If you've enjoyed this episode, if you have learned something from this episode, then the one thing that I would ask is that you hit the subscribe button. In whichever platform you're listening or watching, if you could just hit the subscribe button, that would mean the world to me. Thank you.